Hello and welcome to Game and Read. My name is Peter.
And I'm Erin.
And we are here to do an introduction episode for our second pairing of the new series.
Our second pairing is Murderous Masquerades. So our game is the Sexy Brutale. And our book is the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle.
We're going to go over each one of these just as a base introduction to make sure you know what you're getting into, and then you have the opportunity to read and play along with us over the next 2 weeks while we do our discussion and our pairing talk. Tell me about the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle that I don't already know from the 4.5 hours or so I've listened to the audiobook so far.
Well, I'm going to give you some deets, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about the premise. The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle is written by Stuart Turton. It was also released as the 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle in the UK. It is the same book.
Does England not like halves?
I don't know.
They don't like halvesies?
But halves are very annoying. In most cases, I think.
Well, that's like the 1/2, or would it be the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle?
Either way, they just took the half away in the UK. But it's the same book. So if
Is there a half death? I haven't gotten to that part. Is there something that would qualify as a half death?
Actually, the reason that the book is called the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle in the United States is because another book was coming out around the same time called The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, which is also a great book. Side note, super fun. Absolutely, totally different. But both are 7 things of an Evelyn H.
And you got to really optimize that SEO, so it's adding that 1/2 really sets it apart when Googling.
So this is Stuart Turton's first book. He is currently writing another novel. It's called The Devil in the Dark Water. That is due out sometime in 2020. We don't know what it's about.
But we know the American version will be called The 7.5 Devils in the 8.5 3/4 water.
8.5 3/4?
8.5 3/4. So it's 3/4 of 1/2 of the 8.
Perfect.
I'm good at math.
The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle was published in February of 2018. So it's been out for about 1.5 years. It's a medium to larger book. It's about 430 pages. Or if you're listening to it on audio, like you are, Peter, it is 17-ish hours.
I know we'll get into this in the future, but this is one of the few cases, just getting into this, that I really feel like, I don't know Stuart Turton's background at all. I don't know if he plays games. I think this is the first opportunity in which it almost feels like the game inspired the book, just because of the similarities we'll get to in 2 weeks. But it's eerie how similar the premise is.
There's some really great parallels that I can't wait to talk about when we get to that point of the pairing.
Yes, and the game came out over 1 year before the book, and that's why I say, that order, because generally you don't see games as an inspiration for literature, and it probably wasn't. It's a fairly independent game, but still just like, interesting. Normally you see games kind of taking from books, but this feels the opposite. Were there actually some connection? I don't know if there really is. Probably not.
Interestingly enough, in an interview with thebookreporter.com, Turton was asked about video games and this book. And he said that while he didn't intentionally base the book off a video game, he wasn't going for a video game angle. He has heard that a couple times in different interviews and is actually an avid video game player himself.
I feel like we're making this conspiracy theory now that he was just entirely biting off some concepts from the Sexy Brutale. They are both British. You never know. Maybe a little bit of inspiration. It's definitely a different work so far, just from what I've already gone through, but maybe we're piecing something together here.
to give a brief overview of the premise of the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, there is a party at Blackheath, which is this manor, wonderful manor, and it's owned by the Hardcastles, and they are celebrating the return of their daughter Evelyn. And so they're having this masquerade party. They invite a ton of people to come and stay at the manor and have the celebrations. So I don't want to give away too much in the premise discussion, but just to give you a little bit of an idea of what it's about. The Hardcastles are this family. They own Blackheath Manor. Very
aristocratic.
Thank you. That's a great word. Aristocratic.
It'll be coming up a lot over the next 2 weeks.
The book opens with this character that the reader is following, and it's sort of this frantic...
He has amnesia.
Right. Amnesia, doesn't know who he is, and you find out that this person has to solve the mystery of Blackheath Manor. To solve the mystery, this person has to relive the same day over and over again from different perspectives. As you might imagine, there are some strange forces, things going on in the world of Blackheath Manor. And so as the reader, you're following this sort of lead investigator type as he tries to figure out what is going on. Peter, can you tell us about the Sexy Brutale?
I sure can. Sexy Brutale is a puzzle adventure game available multi-platform, PC, all the main consoles, and it was released on April 12th, 2017. It is developed together with Cavalier Game Studios. It was this small studio's first game, and then there's an additional developer credit with Tequila Works, which is a Spanish studio. However, based on the information I've been able to find, it doesn't necessarily seem like they were a major part in actually guiding the story, designing it, and may have just been more of a technical asset to it. I don't really know. I couldn't find anything breaking it down, but Tequila Works was also the publisher of the game, so perhaps it was a matter of sharing some resources, getting the game together, but most of the work, I think, was done by the Cavalier Studios team, which is a British company. While this is the only game put out by Cavalier Games Studios, they are a fairly experienced group. 2 of the 3 founding members previously worked at Lionshead Game Studios, which made the very popular series of Fable back in the aughts. So Fable 1, 2, and I believe 3, or the third, pretty sure. And Black and White, which was a PC game where you kind of controlled God, but also a giant monster. It was interesting. I played it back in like 2006. And so the lead designer and the lead technical developer were both alums of that studio, which has closed down in recent years. And then the third member, James Griffiths, who's brother of one of those other guys, Charles Griffiths, was the narrative lead for the project, and he was previously at a different studio in England. So they were all kind of from larger companies and decided to come together and make this small studio. And so far, this is the only thing that I've been able to find that they've published or are working on. And it actually seems like James Griffiths, the narrative director, moved on to a different company and is leading that now. So we'll see what he makes in the future. I'd be very interested to see. But that's kind of the background with that. Tequila Works is a Spanish studio that has had several more projects come out over the years, dating back to Deadlight, which was a side-scrolling cinematic platforming survival horror game.
That's a lot of stuff.
A lot of adjectives. And that was published in 2012. I hadn't heard of this game previously, but looking at it a little now, it seems interesting. It's a, side-scrolling zombie game where you're more solving puzzles than actually shooting them, and you're trying to get through a kind of post-apocalyptic Seattle.
That sounds interesting.
Yeah, so I think that was their first kind of critical success in some capacity, and then they got to work on developing Rime, which also came out in 2017, which is a game I've played a little bit of. It's a cinematic 3D puzzle adventure. Puzzle in quotations marks, because I can't remember it being especially puzzly, but it's kind of experiential, kind of adventure-y. It was an interesting game from the little bit that I played of it. They then published this game in 2017 as well, and also have the developing credit, which, whatever they were involved with on that. And then this year, in 2019, they published the Groundhog Day sequel, Like Father, Like Son, which is a VR game set 26 years after the events of the film Groundhog Day, the Bill Murray film, where he has to relive a day over and over and over again.
This seems to be a theme in our pairing that we will talk about a bunch more, but it doesn't seem to be a coincidence that this studio, Tequila Works, is working on, or just
It's published. It's been out for a few months.
Another game that involves reliving things.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I'm curious. After I saw that they had developed that game, which I had heard about but didn't know they were related to, it got me thinking about, like, oh, I wonder how much they were into kind of that time travel thing, or if maybe working on this game got them the license they needed to make Groundhog Day, because you wouldn't expect necessarily a Spanish game studio to wind up with the license to a, late 1980s American film that remains fairly popular because it's the only movie about Groundhog Day and is a pretty good movie, but it just seems weird, and to turn that into a VR game.
It's a very odd choice. I haven't seen Groundhog Day. You can shame me, I don't care. But I know the premise.
I might make you watch it just so that... Because I think that is one of the first things about reliving one day over and over again. I can't think of anything else off the top of my head in fiction or otherwise in which you're just kind of going through the events of one day again and again. So it might be very valuable for our discussion starting next week.
Maybe I'll come back and I'll have watched it.
Moving on to the game itself, Sexy Brutale is set in the eponymous casino/mansion, the Sexy Brutale. You play as Lafcadio Boone and awake on the day of the casino's annual masquerade to find that the staff are roving the house, killing the guests in elaborate ways. You are tasked by a mysterious bloody specter to save them. You are able to do this by rewinding time to the beginning of the day, changing the outcomes of each murder as an unseen interloper. The catch is that you cannot be in the same room as any other character, or else you will be pushed back to the start of the day. You must save all the victims and unravel the mystery of the Sexy Brutale. It is an interesting... It's a top-down puzzle game, so you are controlling a figure in these kind of elaborate dollhouse scenes is what it ends up looking like. They are kind of three-quarters perspective. Everything kind of has a nice 3D cartoon sheen to it, but is still very gothic and elaborate European casino inspired.
The look of this game definitely reminds me of the miniature rooms, or dollhouse, I think is a great way to describe it, but with a Moulin Rouge-y kind of glitz and glam, plus exaggerated cartoony sheen.
When you hear the term set in a casino, you might picture something a little bit more Las Vegas-y. I imagine that most of our listeners are American, or at least North American, but this is much more of a kind of Monaco feel to it, a very aristocratic, bringing that word back into it, feel where it is a casino, but it's all in this guy's big elaborate mansion. There's a big servant staff. It's like an elite mini casino rather than kind of a big palace of gambling like you would see in, kind of the big American casinos.
You need an invitation to get in.
Yes, and if you have an invitation, you're probably going to die. So you go through these days and you do your best to solve all the mysteries, but you kind of jump from person to person saying, oh, I'm going to solve this person's murder, oh, I'm going to prevent this person's murder, going through that step by step, and you learn a lot more as you go, and you get different abilities from the people you save, and I think that's all I'm going to say on it, except that I do really recommend playing this game. I would say that for most of the games we do, I don't waste my time with games that I don't think are fun. I don't want to talk about them for 3 hours. But this is one that is short in length. It took us about 10 hours. We played it together, trading off the controller. And a pretty interesting and fun game, and I think you can find it on sale a lot of the time, and it's available on everything.
I definitely second that. I think it was really fun to play it together. And we'll talk more about the actual play experience next week. But it's a both low stress, high stress kind of game. It's not high stress because you have to aim, which are the kinds of games that always stress me out. But just this time aspect and actually figuring out the information and what's going on. It's a really fun way to spend 10-ish hours.
And it does break it down into fairly digestible chunks. If you're going to solve just one particular murder, I would say, unless you get really stuck on it, shouldn't take you more than an hour each, give or take, especially if you're playing consistently and kind of remember the stuff that you did last time. The one note on this I would say is if you do choose to buy and play this game, I would recommend playing it on any device but the Switch. We ended up playing it on our Switch just because that's what we owned it on. But there were some load time issues, some lag issues that I don't think you would get with, say, a PS4, an Xbox One, or a higher end or at least gaming ready PC.
That is our introduction to this pairing, the Murderous Masquerades pairing. We'll be talking about the book and the game individually and in depth next week. So if you don't want to be spoiled, don't listen to next week's episode until you've read and/or played. And then the week after will be our deep dive pairing discussion where we talk about the two in relation to each other.
You can find all of our episodes, other posts that we do, all the information you need about this project at gameandread.wordpress.com.
You can find me on Instagram at A Tale of Two Shelves.
And I am on Twitter at NerdInTheWorld. Our music is written and performed by Avery Murchison.
You can find a link to his Bandcamp in the description of this episode. Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you next week.
Game and Read.